Well, I want to start by thanking everybody for coming out this morning. I know it's always hard first thing in the morning to come even before the keynote, so I appreciate your eagerness to come and learn. It's good to start with a nice, easy topic like data valuation at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning. Yeah. We'll just start by telling you a little bit about ourselves. So I'm Sean Hewitt. This is Josh Reed. We're with 6E Data Services. So like many other professionals here, we help companies become more data-driven through data governance, data enablement, data strategy, things like that. I have to show you our headshots. We paid a lot of money for these, so I have to get the return on the investment there. Won't spend a lot of time on this. If you're interested more, you can come talk to us later. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to give you a little more information on what we mean by data valuation. We will talk about the challenges of assessing monetary value of data. We will discuss the concept of data as a liability. We always talk about data as an asset, but data can also be a liability, and a pretty significant one. We will talk about the main reason we're here is to present one approach to assessing data value. And lastly, we'll have a discussion around how going through this process of assigning value to your data can help from a data management perspective. Okay, so let's jump right in. So data valuation. So ultimately, from our perspective, we're assigning a strategic value to data. So we're assigning metadata to a data asset. We can do this at a variety of different levels of granularity. We can do it at a very high level, like at a customer record level versus product versus a data product, right? A predictive model or an AI product. We can assign value to any of those things. The question is, should we? And when is it advantageous to do that? Yep.
The evaluation of a customer master record, you're saying that a Walmart data record for customers is more valuable than a small mom-and-pop store?
No, primarily I'm seeing this done within the business itself. It's used primarily to identify what are your critical data assets versus kind of secondary ones. So what is the impact on the business? In terms of comparing data assets across organizations, that can come in when you're talking about data sharing or even a data marketplace, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But ultimately, when we see this come up with organizations, these are the three main use cases that we see. Because evaluating or assigning a strategic value to your data isn't necessarily easy. And it's a commitment. So you need to understand what are the outcomes you're striving for, and then design your evaluation methodology around that. So the three main use cases we're seeing is to save time. Help us prioritize our efforts on the things that really matter. How many of you are in data governance programs where you have enough resources to do all the work you need to do? Right? Okay. I figured that was a pretty safe question. So this will help us identify what are those critical assets. So if you have a backlog of 300 data quality issues that you need to tackle, how are you going to prioritize those? And this will help, right? Because it gives you a quick indication of where that low-hanging fruit is, or where you really need to invest that time. Reducing risk. So more and more often, I'm hearing companies say they want to go out and collect additional data to support X. A good example is collecting additional data from our customers to really understand diversity, including self-identification and ethnicity, and the correlation to customer retention. Okay? That's a big ask. That's a lot of data to collect, especially if you get into looking at intersectionality of those dimensions. So if you're going to do that, you really you need to understand the value of doing it, but also what is involved in collecting that data. You don't have it now. Can you actually get that data? How are you going to manage it? And is it worth doing? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about as we go through this. And then driving outcomes. So understanding, where is your valuable data and how to protect it, and making sure that it is being used effectively. Can anybody think of any other potential use cases where data value, having a clearly defined value for your data might help your organization? Stakeholder engagement, excellent.
I was thinking of your risk, the example you gave, a lawyer suing you for discrimination.
Exactly, right? If you're collecting that data, then are you going to be using that data to predict the employee success rates, right? Based on those dimensions and things like that. It's a very slippery slope. So definitely some interesting conversations we can have around that later. Okay, any questions around how we're defining data evaluation before we move on?
Are you separating on data that is kind of sellable itself, kind of monetizing on collecting and selling it, or kind of the back or inside out?
That's a great segue. So primarily the data that you are using internally. It could be for data sharing purposes as well. But when you were looking at monetizing, like assessing the monetary value of that data, it gets very complicated. It's very subjective. And the monetary value of that data to you may not be the same as it is to me, right? And this is why. So it really depends on who the recipient is and how they're going to use that data. Sorry, I'm going to move down here because I don't have my glasses on. I can't see there. So, as I said, some data is highly valuable to some organizations and worthless to others. So it really depends on that business and what they're trying to achieve with it, and that will drive up the monetary value. How difficult it is to get that data from other sources. If that data is very unique and you can't get it anywhere else, of course it has a higher monetary value. The economic or public benefit of the data. So the public benefit is a huge one. So if releasing this data will help us, coming out of COVID, you can think of, there's a lot of data out there that if we release that, it might help us avoid that situation in the future or something like that. So there's many other considerations that can come up if we are looking at monetizing data, and that's why it's so difficult for companies to do, because it's always different for every organization. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just as an organization, you need to figure out what these characteristics are, or what these variables are. So data is a liability. So has anybody come up with this, or like in their organizations, do they look at data this way? Not just as an asset, but as a liability. Right.
But this is traditionally kind of how we view it.
Exactly. So from a risk management governance perspective. But even if that data on its own doesn't create a compliance or regulatory risk, it's still a liability. It still costs money. It still consumes resources. And if any of you were in the sustainability chat last night, now I'm aware that there's an environmental impact to information sitting there. So if you have a lot of information sitting there, even if it's not sensitive information or that has regulatory requirements to it, it's still a liability. And so the last thing we want to do is bring information into our ecosystem that doesn't really provide value but creates liability, right? Especially if it involves sensitive information, which creates additional compliance requirements, right? So if we're bringing on information, marketing, they always want to collect more information on, potential clients. We need to really understand the impact of doing that, the total cost of ownership for that information. So when we bring it in, we understand what we're getting into and whether we can actually sustain that information. Sorry, did you have a question?
I am a greedy data collector. I'm always saying, what if the business owner is going to ask a strange question and I don't have the data? So I'm constantly, how do I balance my greed against what you're saying here?
That is a great question. So I'm just going to repeat it so we get that on the camera. So in a lot of organizations, you get kind of, not attacked, but these put on the spot with these questions from executives and others that you need to have that data in your back pocket so you can defend that. And I think it's going to go in a direction where it's not about having that data there available for when the question gets asked. It's being able to get the data you need with agility as right away through other sources. So instead of bringing that data in and having it available, it'll be through marketplaces and other places. So you don't own that data, but you know how to get it as quickly as you can to answer that question. And you're managing expectations with those executives saying, we could collect all of this data to answer your questions faster, but here's the cost of doing that, right? And if you're happy with that cost, we will do that. It will cost, here's the environmental impact, here's the resource impact, all of that of collecting that data. And we can incorporate that thinking into our methodology for scoring the data.
I think everyone's well aware that just data as it is doesn't have a lot of value. So there's a lot of work that goes into making that data valuable.
That's
Just having it is not the value.
exactly, that's a key point. So if you have data, we talked about data having value. Well, I have a garage that's half filled with lumber that, to me has value, but it's not doing it to my wife. It has no value. It's a liability. It's sitting there. It's in the way. We can't sell it because it's from an old project that we recycled. So it's only value if I turn that into something valuable and I'm using it to create value. If it's just sitting there, it is a liability. So we have a tendency to collect all of this data because we think we'll need it, and that's called hoarding. So we hoard this data, and there's a misconception. We're told storage is cheap, right? It doesn't matter. Let's load up our data lake house or our data lake with all this data because we need agility. We need to get that data as quickly as possible, and that's changing. And sustainability is definitely going to be an important aspect of that. Then quality issues, right? So if we bring this information in, can we guarantee the quality? Is it going to be fit for purpose, or is it going to become a nightmare where we have to constantly clean this data and monitor it because it's not coming from a reliable source? Okay. Any other ideas on how data could be a liability?
Also, I mean, I worked with a law firm before, and so there's obviously everything you have is discoverable in that sense of something,
Exactly.
So if you have it, you have to hand it over, in that e-discovery sense as well. So
Exactly. So it comes down to the retention piece. So are you keeping it too long? So yeah, if you keep it too long, it's outlived its useful life. So right away, we already know that becomes a liability from a legal perspective. Okay, moving on. So our approach for assessing, the value of data, and this is an approach that we've used several times to give you some ideas. We're not saying you have to do it this way. In fact, this will not work for you as is. This is meant to give you some ideas that you can take away, come up with your own criteria, standardize that criteria, and then use that. But this is just to give you a vision of what's possible. So we start off by identifying and engaging stakeholders. So you could do this for an enterprise standard on how you're going to evaluate data. It could be by domain. You have to figure out what is the scope of evaluation, because you can't be changing it all the time, because then you have apples and oranges. You can't use it to prioritize. You can't use it to really be strategic around your data. You have to land on a standard, use that, and if you change that, you have to reevaluate everything against the new standard, right? So you want to be, you want to put some decent thought into this. We're going to start by scoring the positive aspects of the data. So kind of what is the gross value of that data? So if we don't look at the liability aspect, what do we think the value of that data is? Then we're going to look at the flip side. Data is liability. What are the negative aspects of that data and scoring those? Then we're going to give it a net score. Obviously just doing some basic math, subtracting. And then we're going to assign metadata. We will map those scores to a category or a classification, okay? So scoring the positive criteria. So I've just I'll read through these. It's going to be hard for everybody to see, but these are just some ideas. This is what one organization we worked with came up with for their criteria. These will not be the same that you use, but there might be a couple on here that you would use. So first one, data is critical to the delivery and goods of services. This is a pretty standard one for most organizations. And you might not think that there is data that exists that's not critical to your delivery of goods and services, but often there is. That's used for ancillary processes or things like that. Data is used for financial reporting, okay? Strategic planning. Data is used for forecasting. Data is monetized to support commerce, as a revenue stream. Data is being shared or published externally, right? So if you are sharing this with the public or the government agencies, anything like that, that could increase the value of that data overall. And I've separated those from monetization and sharing, because they are two different things. Data is used for reporting and analytics. That's a typical one we see, so much so that we've split out the advanced analytics piece. Data is difficult to replace or if it's lost, right? So, if you are creating that data internally and it takes a lot of effort to collect that, and if you lose it, or if you're procuring it from another organization and you would have to jump through some hoops to get that data back. Data is not collected by other organizations, so you get the idea, right? So data quality is high, data is current, that's an important one. So we work with a lot of organizations, government agencies that procure, over 75% of the data they use, right? So this was used by them because they always had to go through that process. Is this worth procuring that data? And that's where they get into the currency. Like, how current is the data that they're going to procure, and does it fit in with the analysis that they want to do? And is data required to support regulatory requirements? Okay. Can anybody think of any, within your organizations, what type of criteria do you think you would use to score the positive aspects, the positive value of data?
I'll add one in.
I couldn't figure out where that was coming from.
I'd say it provides a positive customer experience.
Excellent, excellent. Any other ideas? Critical for some of the services?
Because service is often a broad thing.
Yes.
There might be something there that is a result of a lot of data,
It-
or engineering or whatever, algorithms or
Yes,
because
yeah.
you don't always see it, right? In the service, it might be one of the elements there that has a lot of data behind it.
It could be. It could be even data that helps you understand your services better and how well you're doing. So those kind of performance metrics around that. You know, in this example, we've kind of clustered those under the reporting and the analytics, but you could call that out separately if you want. It really depends on your organization. But the important thing is that you pull the right people together, you know, the smart people, and this is where governance can help, and come up with or get consensus on how you are going to do this. And you shouldn't have a list of 100 different criteria that you're scoring because it won't be sustainable. Keep it as small as you can to get a meaningful number. And there's a scoring method that goes with this. You don't have to use the one that we're putting up here, but it's a Likert scale. So we're going from 0 to 7, where 0 is. So each of those statements, we are scoring how true it is. So all of the positive criteria is stated in a positive manner. So if we don't agree, we're giving it a low score. If we agree, we give it a high score. Okay? Pretty standard stuff. How you define these can be a little tricky because it gets a little subjective here. So what we find works best is this, putting kind of a percentage of certainty. So for 1, probably not, we're saying it's greater than 85% chance that the statement is not true. So if we think that the data is used for financial reporting, 1, I'm 85% certain that that is not true. Okay? We don't have to be exact here. This is supposed to give us some guidance in terms of how we're prioritizing and organizing our data assets. So on the flip side, 6, 100% certain. Is this data used for advanced analytics? 6, absolutely. I can point to the predictive model where we're using that or the AI product that's using that data.
Scoring still help with instances like, so obviously if it's used for reporting, it's curated, you have a lot easier time ascertaining the value of data that's been curated for a specific
Yes.
purpose versus data that's sitting out there that you might use in the future. So is this kind of a way to kind of ascertain the value of kind of maybe uncategorized data or data that's not yet been curated?
Yes. Yeah. So I've definitely seen it that way. So it could be deployed that way where you're focusing on more of the kind of the raw data and kind of conceptual groupings of that raw data so you understand how you need to manage that. But you could also apply this to the refined data products. It's really a question of the value of doing it that way and the sustainability, right? Every organization is different. Can you actually sustain this model? And where do you need to deploy it to really get value out of the model itself? Okay. So this is just an example of how we've used this with the one organization. We went one step farther and added a weighting to the criteria. Okay, so, but there's a lot of discussion and negotiation that needs to go into defining weighting. So I would start off, with something simple. Simple's better, but in this case, they wanted the weighting there. Then the rest is simple math. So we have our score, we go through, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on this. And we're not doing this at a field level or a table level unless there's a specific use case for doing that. So let's say we have our employee record, and there's a business case to add a couple new fields to that employee record, and we're not sure if we should do that or not. So we could go through this process to evaluate does it make sense to do that, to add those additional data points to that employee record? Okay. And then later on, you can fall back to this. When people are questioning the decision to do that, you can show that you went through and took a very mature approach to making that decision, and that decision is documented. Because quite often we make decisions around data architecture or models and stuff, and then 6 months later we're saying, why the heck did we do that? So at least this will give us a bit of a paper trail. You could even incorporate this into an app. If you use There's lots of apps that you can build for this. It'd be nice if eventually we saw some of this functionality in a data catalog where you can click on a data asset and it prompts you these questions and you can score it. Maybe someday we'll see that. But ultimately we get down to the bottom, we have our net value or our gross value. And next, what we need to do is look at the flip side. How are we doing for time? We're pretty good. So, same thing. So we pulled a group of people together. We got consensus on what the criteria was. We kept it pretty small. Your list will be different, but ultimately you get the idea. So here we came up with, data contains sensitive personal information. Data has other regulatory requirements, right? So these are all stated still in the positive, but they're implying that, the liability's there. Right? Data is expensive to procure and or store. You could even split that out, but that's the way they wanted it phrased. Data refresh interval is unreliable, or it's a one-time thing. So it's going to become obsolete pretty fast. Data is difficult to clean. The last thing we want to do is create more work for people or mistrust in the data. Data is difficult to integrate, right? So that data, the codes that are used in that data doesn't align to what we have, so now we have to go through and convert that data to match what we have so we can get our final analysis. Data is difficult to acquire. Data is redundant with existing data. So this organization that we were working with, there was a group that wanted to go out and procure this additional data that was the same data they already have, but collected through different means. And they wanted it for comparison, but then all kinds of red flags went off. So we went through this process to determine, is that smart or not to bring that data in? And then what are the controls we need to put around that specific data set to make sure that it is not misused and creates more problems than value? And lastly, data has restrictions on use. Okay, so we have a contract, we have a license for that data for a defined set of use cases. There's a risk that it might be used for other things accidentally and exposes us to potential contract breaches. The additional one that came up from sitting in the sustainability session yesterday was the environmental impact of the data. So if, let's say we're talking IoT data, like the volume of that data, what is the environmental impact of bringing that data in? Okay. Any questions about this? Any suggestions of what might be criteria in your organization? Okay. You might notice that in all of these, I'm using data is, although data is plural. How many of you actually use data are in that scenario? Good, good. My rationale is data is raw material, so I treat it like water. I treat it like oil. You don't say oil are, water are, so you, little sidebar. Okay, why is it? I don't know why it's doing that. I'll just quickly flip through. Okay, so similar to what we did with positive, we have a weighting on this. Ultimately, we get down, we have our liability offset. Yes, yes.
So I was looking at, is the data redundant with existing data? And we have to have trouble knowing that.
Yeah.
For sure, there's a lot of work that you do in figuring that out. So it would be sometimes, or could be, like
Yeah.
that's what I was kind of curious on scale.
Exactly, and that's why you have to be careful as to how you write the sentence, right? Because you want the scale to work for both the positive and negatives. So here, all of these statements are implying that the that condition exists. And then we're scoring it on the positive scale. So once again, 6 here is 100% yes, I agree with that statement. Right? But the statement itself is implying that there's a liability there. So that's why this scale works. So we have our offset score of 52. And as you can guess, we just do the math. So when we look at just the positive criteria, it looked pretty good. It looked like bringing this data in. It might be a smart thing to do. But then we look at the flip side, gets a score of 52, and we have a net value score of 32. Okay, well, what does that mean? So there's another step where we have to kind of define the scoring of this. So we're kind of grouping these scores into meaningful categories that can be actually used as metadata in your catalog. So in this case, we've just done some simple grouping. So we're going from very low to very high. You have to go through, once you finalize everything in that spreadsheet, you have to figure out what are the maximum values and then kind of group things accordingly. And there's some negotiation there that has to happen to come up with this. But once you standardize this, you want to lock it down, because once you start deploying that metadata and that scoring mechanism, you don't want to have to go back and redo everything. So take the time to do it right the first time. So ultimately, we can use this to support data management activities. We talked about saving time, we talked about managing risk and driving outcomes. Now that you've gone through this and kind of seen how this comes together and the metadata that it creates, do you have any thoughts on how, beyond what we've talked about here, how else can we use this to support our data management activities, whether it's privacy, security, metadata management, access management? Any thoughts?
You can also use it to help decide what data to curate or what data is worth their effort.
Exactly.
Your team, and assign an actual value to the effort that your team has for requests.
Yeah, and definitely, and not just for curation, for master data management, data quality, anything like that. So it's the main benefit of doing this is helping you work smarter, deploying your resources and your efforts more effectively. Now, the question is, does the effort it takes to deploy this, does that balance with the effort you're going to save, or is there actual savings to be had there? And you need to ask that. Figure out, you want to figure out how to deploy this in a way that you're actually gaining benefit from deploying this and not just creating more work. Because it's not something that would be easy to automate, because you need the subject matter expertise there to answer the questions. But it can help you prevent things from getting worse, right? So when you are looking at adding new data, like we talked about, you're looking at procuring data, either through data sharing agreements or through data marketplaces, being smarter about it so you're not creating more overhead and more problems.
Well, like one of the use cases I was thinking this would work great in my organizations, they have like a list, right? They call them, like data request list, right? And it's like 200 category, 200 long. But people aren't valuing that work, right?
Right.
They're just requesting it.
Exactly.
So if you something to score, is this effort that they're requesting worth your data team's time
Yeah.
to do or not?
Yeah, exactly. So, if you have a lot of work coming in, requests, right, and it could be data quality work, it could be even developing new reports, AI tools, anything like that, you could use this approach to evaluate all of that, the benefit of doing all of those. And that's where I'm seeing it deployed more than kind of classifying your data lake or anything like that. It's more helping kind of look at the new stuff that's coming in and making sure we're not making our situation worse than it is. Yep.
To what degree do you break down, like, let's say customer data, right? That could be really wide in breadth. So to what degree do you break that down into maybe subcategories for that, or is that necessary?
That's a great question. I'm going to repeat that for the camera as well. So the question is, to what degree do we break down a data entity like customer or product to sub-entities to know how to score those? Because they could be scored differently. So the way I would approach something like the customer record is identifying what are the critical customer fields, right? What do you absolutely need to do business with? And then looking at kind of additional, usually you have extension fields and stuff in your customer master. So trying to break it down that way. You could look at, basic customer address information. You could break that customer record down to, the customer identification, address, pricing. You could do it at that level as well. And same with product. You could do kind of your core product record, but then pricing tables and bill of materials, all of that stuff kind of separately.
I can see that spawning off into all kinds of other efforts.
It could.
Highlighting data that you may not realize.
Yeah. And that's why you really need to be smart about how you deploy this, because it can become a rat's nest if you try deploying it everywhere, right? Yes, at the back?
Is this evaluation that you hold times on the same data, kind of have a benchmark that track against over time?
So just to repeat that, just in case you guys didn't hear it. So is this something that you would repeat on a regular basis, or is it a one-time thing and then it's done? The answer is yes. So you could do it either way. I think it is good to reevaluate, because throughout the life cycle of that data, it may lose value. The use cases for that data will change over time. We hope that as we mature as an organization, we are better at reusing data to derive value out of that data, and better at eliminating data once it's gone beyond its useful life. Yes.
Take it a step further. As we mature in doing valuation, we may want to revisit the oldest ones we did with fresh light and insights.
Exactly. And just the people you have in the room could give you different results in your evaluation as well, right? So it all depends on your environment and how fast things change, and how your data ecosystem, how things are being reused and shared, and all of that. And it could be you could do this based on the level of risk in the data as well. So some organizations we've worked with, they will pair this with the risk score, right? So we kind of touch on risk a little bit here, but they'll actually use they have a standard methodology for assigning a risk score to this, and the criticality is done a little differently. So they've incorporated things like the data is used by 3 or more functional groups within the organization, right? Or the data has a direct impact on our customers or members, things like that. So, yes.
At what level are you measuring this, like database or tables, or just in general?
Yeah. So the question is, at what level are we measuring this? Are we doing it at a database level? Are we doing it at tables, field level, rows? The answer is really what makes the most sense for you as an organization. Keep it as simple as possible. So we usually do it at a conceptual level, like an entity model where we're looking at customer data.
Like a domain, right? That's
Yeah.
what we're doing here, kind of like a data domain.
Exactly. I wouldn't do it at a table level. As I mentioned before, there might be a specific use case where you are debating the value of adding additional fields to a table, right? Then you could use it there, but that's just for supporting that decision. It's not the entire record itself, right? Okay. But I would avoid using it for planning to deploy it for all databases, tables, queries, things like that.
Understand how well data domains are, especially supporting like business.
Yep.
Having data governance, those type of things, so we can measure maturity over time, right?
Yep.
And once the maturity.
No, that's good. That's excellent. One way I've seen this used is with self-serve data products. So you're putting a data product together, making it available for business, or you're debating the value of doing that and trying to make a decision. You could have requests for 50 data products. Which ones make the most sense or are going to drive the most value, the most net value for the business. It won't be perfect because there's going to be times where that data product is, driven by some other initiative, right? That could change the outcome here, but this is just a guide that you can use. How are we doing for time? Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Any other questions or anything? I don't think we have any other slides here. Going through that. I don't know why that, I'm pressing the wrong button. That's why that happened before. Key takeaways. Here we go. So yes, valuation can help in some use cases. I would be cautious about planning to deploy this enterprise-wide on everything. Data can be a liability. This is important, and it's going to become more and more important. We need to look at it that way for a variety of reasons: risk, sustainability. If you're going to have data available for people, you need to make sure they have the right level, the right knowledge to consume that data. Right? That's when the risks of just bringing in, of hoarding data, is you have it there. If you make it available to people, you need to make sure they have the knowledge to use it safely. So your validation logic, the logic you're using here needs to be highly aligned to your business. And that's why we can't just give you a standard framework that you can walk away with. We're giving you a concept here that you can take. It's pretty simple, but coming up with consensus on the criteria and deploying it can be a bit of a challenge. Sorry, you had one more question? All good? Any other questions or comments, jokes, songs? No? Okay. Well, we'll let you get over to the keynote, and thank you very much. I appreciate you all taking time this morning.